Saigon, South Vietnam, April 1975. The sounds of automatic gunfire and artillery can be heard coming from the outskirts of the South Vietnamese capital city. The North Vietnamese army is on its way, with the South Vietnamese army powerless to stop them. Despair and hopelessness can be felt across the city as thousands of South Vietnamese flock to the airport and the US Embassy in a desperate attempt to escape the North Vietnamese. These chaotic weeks in April signified the end of one of the most significant conflicts in the 20th century. It spanned for almost 30 years and pitted the colonial power of France, as well as the Cold War superpower of the United States of America, against a ragtag group of Vietnamese guerrillas. This conflict is the Vietnam War. How's it? My name is Dr. JWDREEXLLDXOJESD. As always, this is Stashy, and you're watching The Historian Stash. In the next couple of episodes, we delve into one of the most significant and controversial conflicts of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. Lasting from 1946 to 1975, this war profoundly shaped not only the countries involved, but also international relations and the global perception of warfare. Now, this is a controversial topic, and it will ruffle some feathers. But that is history for you. So, on that note, let's gooi. The French involvement in the Vietnam War stemmed from their colonial presence in Southeast Asia. France colonized Vietnam in the late 19th century as part of French Indochina, along with Laos and Cambodia. Throughout the early 20th century, Vietnamese nationalists, inspired by ideas of independence and self-determination, began resisting French colonial rule. After World War II, nationalist movements intensified, with its oak called Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh rebels who had had enough of the Frenchies in their backyard.
So you're French?
Oui.
We? No, we are not French.
So in 1946, the First Indochina War broke out between Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh and French colonial forces. Despite enjoying some early successes, the French just couldn't suppress the nationalist movement. They faced significant challenges, including guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Minh. The conflict escalated, drawing international attention and intervention. Then in 1954, the deadlock was broken at the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This resulted in a stunning victory for the Viet Minh, forcing France to negotiate and sign the Geneva Accords. These accords granted independence to Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, but divided Vietnam into North and South along an imaginary line called the 17th parallel, with North Vietnam under communist control and South Vietnam under a Western-backed regime. While the French formally withdrew from Vietnam, their involvement set the stage for further conflict as the United States of America stepped in to support the South Vietnamese government in its fight against communist forces, ultimately leading to full-scale war. By 1957, communist rebels called the Viet Cong had begun fighting the South Vietnamese government under this very pro-Western dude called Ngo Dien Diem. The Viet Cong were trained and supported by the North Vietnamese Army, or the NBA, and a steady stream of communist fighters joined the Viet Cong from the north. The Viet Cong knew that they couldn't match the South Vietnamese army in a conventional war, so they engaged in guerrilla warfare. They hid by day and attacked by night.
You don't seem to want to accept the fact that you're dealing with an expert in guerrilla warfare.
Now remember, the 1950s and 60s were smack bang in the middle of the Cold War. So in an attempt to contain the spread of communism in Asia, the US supported Diem and his regime. During the late 1950s, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower initially sent 900 military advisors to train the South Vietnamese army. His successor, President John F. Kennedy, decided to increase military involvement in Vietnam. By November 1963, Kennedy had 16,000 US military personnel on the ground in Vietnam. But despite this, the Viet Cong had seized control of much of South Vietnam. Meanwhile, Diem was losing support among the South Vietnamese people. One reason for this was his harsh treatment of Buddhists. Diem was a devout Roman Catholic, but most Vietnamese were Buddhists. Diem imprisoned and killed hundreds of Buddhists. More and more people turned against him. Even US officials saw that Diem and his regime were off the chain, so they began discussing the possibility of a regime change. The Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, contacted South Vietnamese generals who were already planning to remove Diem and told them that the US would not oppose such a move nor punish the generals by cutting off aid. So on the 2nd of November 1963, Diem was overthrown and executed by his own army.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Following the coup, chaos in South Vietnam ensued. The North Vietnamese took advantage of the situation and increased its support for the Viet Cong. South Vietnam entered a period of extreme political instability, as one military regime toppled another in quick succession, like a game of musical chairs. Each new regime was viewed by the communists as a puppet of the Americans.
You're standing on a table pretending to be a puppet.
Who's pretending?
US military advisors were embedded at every level of the South Vietnamese armed forces. The Kennedy administration sought to refocus US efforts to counter the growing threat of insurgency and turn to winning over the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese population. But the US military leadership was not keen to have US soldiers take part in anything other than conventional troop training. The commander of US forces in South Vietnam at the time, General Paul Hawkins, confidently predicted victory by Christmas 1963. But the CIA was less optimistic, warning that the Viet Cong were in control of much of the countryside and was steadily increasing the overall intensity of the effort. Despite the unsettling report from the CIA, the US continued its support of South Vietnam militarily. Then, in August 1964, the North Vietnamese reportedly attacked 2 US warships that were on an intelligence mission along the North Vietnamese coastline in the Gulf of Tonkin.
The first attack came on August 2, 1964, when the USS Medics was allegedly fired upon. A second attack was reported on August 4th on the USS Joy as well as the USS Medics in the same area. The circumstances of the attacks were murky. An undated NSA publication later declassified in 2005 revealed that there was no second attack on August 4th. It was this second attack that led to retaliatory airstrikes from the US military, and it also prompted the US Congress to approve the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964, which would lead to large-scale US military intervention in Vietnam. This has led many to believe that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a false flag operation by the US government to justify military involvement in Southeast Asia.
The Gulf of Tonkin resolution granted the president power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, would rely on this resolution as giving him authority to expand and escalate the war.
That escalated quickly.
The US National Security Council recommended a three-stage escalation of the aerial bombing of North Vietnam. This led to a series of airstrikes, namely Operation Flaming Dart, Operation Rolling Thunder, and Operation Arc Light. The bombing campaign ultimately lasted 3 years and was intended to force North Vietnam to stop its support for the Viet Cong by threatening to destroy North Vietnamese air defenses and industrial infrastructure. Another aim was to bolster the morale of the South Vietnamese. Between March 1965 and November 1968, 1 million tons of missiles, rockets, and bombs were dropped on North Vietnam during Operation Rolling Thunder. But bombing was not restricted to North Vietnam. Other aerial campaigns such as Operation Barrel Roll targeted different parts of the Viet Cong and NVA infrastructure. These included the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply route, which ran through Laos and Cambodia. The supposedly neutral Laos became the scene of a civil war, pitting the Laotian government, backed by the US, against the communist Pathet Lao and its North Vietnamese allies. Massive aerial bombardment against the Pathet Lao and NVA forces were carried out by the US to prevent the collapse of the Laos government and to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. On the 8th of March 1965, 3,500 US Marines landed near Da Nang, South Vietnam. By December, this number increased to a whopping 200,000. This marked the beginning of the American Ground War. At this stage, US public opinion overwhelmingly supported the deployment of US soldiers in Vietnam. Now, importantly, the US military was geared towards offensive warfare, taking control of the situation and attacking and defeating the enemy with superior equipment and training. But in Vietnam, the role of US forces was to contain the enemy and defend South Vietnam by supporting the South Vietnamese army. As a result, the commanders were institutionally and psychologically unsuited to this kind of defensive mission. But this position soon changed. The new commander of US forces in South Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, was convinced that US troops with their energy, mobility, and firepower can successfully take the fight to the Viet Cong.
Now, let's go get those Viet Congs.
Viet Cong!
What?
It's Viet Cong. There's no S. It's already plural. You wouldn't say Chinese's.
With this, Westmoreland called for an aggressive departure from America's defensive posture and the sidelining of the South Vietnamese army. As a result, the US commitment to the war was now unlimited. By 1968, the US had more than 500,000 troops in Vietnam. Small units from South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines also helped the South Vietnamese. But major allies like the NATO countries of Canada and Great Britain refused requests from the US to send their troops to Vietnam. On the other hand, the communist governments of the Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam and the Viet Cong with weapons, financial aid, and troops. The US and its allies mounted complex search and destroy operations designed to find enemy forces, destroy them, and then withdraw, typically using helicopters. In November 1965, the US engaged in its first major battle with the NVA at the Battle of Ia Drang. The operation was the first large-scale helicopter air assault by the US. These tactics continued in 1966 to 1967, but the NVA and the Viet Cong insurgents remained elusive and demonstrated great tactical flexibility. By 1967, the war had generated large-scale internal refugees, numbering nearly 2.1 million in South Vietnam. Despite US forces continuing to conduct major operations, the NVA and Viet Cong proved to be elusive, using a system of underground tunnels to move from one area to the next without being seen. As a result, they were able to choose their battles with ease. Therefore, the war was characterized by smaller unit contacts or engagements. Up to the war's end, the NVA and the Viet Cong would initiate 90% of large firefights. 80% of those were clear and well-planned operations, so the NVA and Viet Cong forces retained the strategic initiative despite overwhelming US numbers and firepower. The NVA and Viet Cong had also developed strategies capable of countering US military doctrines and tactics. These strategies included a flexible combination of using guerrilla and conventional warfare. But by the end of 1967, the NVA and Viet Cong were planning to launch the mother of all attacks in an attempt to achieve final victory. This attack would change everything. That's it for now. Stay tuned for part 2. Until next time, stay stashy.